Hopefully most of you remember that we had this parallel gospel passage not that long ago. I believe it was one of the Sunday masses, maybe just 2 Sundays ago. And of course that was from the Gospel of Mark, whereas this is from the Gospel of Matthew. So we see it's a little bit different. St. Matthew summarized it a little bit more, but in both miracles that take place, the raising of the young girl from the dead, as well as the woman who has the hemorrhage and she's healed of her illness, both of these miracles are very astounding, and we've heard this passage many times. We're familiar with the miracles of our Lord. It's easy for us just to take it for granted. Notice how when our Lord, comes to raise the girl from the dead, and he says the girl is not dead but just sleeping, they laugh at him. Why does our Lord say that she's just sleeping? Well, part of it was he didn't want to make a big deal of the miracle. He knew the people were not ready for the fullness of the truth. But from the point of view of God, when we die, our bodies are, in a sense, just sleeping, even though they disintegrate, even though they rot. In other words, God intends to resurrect us from the dead. And it's interesting how our Lord uses that very same term of Lazarus. If you remember when Lazarus died, and he was in the tomb for, I can't remember how many days, but our Lord again said of him, he's just sleeping, he's just asleep. And of course, he was fully dead. But, imagine in our own midst, someone someone close to you, they die. And let's say they're taken to the funeral home and they're going to prepare the body for viewing or whatever. And then this fellow comes along, let's say Jesus, and raises the person from the dead. Imagine what a great miracle that is. So in other words, we don't realize the magnitude of these miracles. We've heard them so often. We're just so familiar with thinking about them. But it's hard to imagine in real life. But this is what happened when our Lord raises the young girl. And even in regards to the woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years, she just touches his cloak. She just comes into contact with him. She doesn't even touch his physical body, but just his cloak, and she is healed. And it's a reminder to us that contact with our Lord brings us the graces of God, possibly even the miraculous healing graces of God. And in the case of the woman who touches his cloak, as well as the synagogue leader, 2 things are required here for the miracles to be able to take place. One is that they have faith, and not just faith, but that they have great faith. And the second thing is that they need to come into contact with God, with Jesus Christ. And the same applies to us. So we need to come into contact with God, but we also need to have great faith. And for us, the problem is that we lack faith. In other words, how do we come close to God? How do we come into contact with God? Well, yes, through prayer, primarily through the Mass, and primarily through our worthy reception of Holy Communion. So in other words, we are doing far more than just touching the cloak of Christ. We are not only physically touching him with our hands when we receive him in the hand, but he enters into us, into our souls. There can be no greater union, no greater contact than that. But the problem is we lack faith. Think, for example, in Lourdes, where Our Lady appeared to St. Bernadette in 1854. So thousands of miracles have taken place there. The church only accepts maybe about 68 of them because they use very strict criteria for determining whether something is an authentic miracle or not. But thousands of miracles have taken place. What's very interesting about Lourdes, and as you know, there's this miraculous spring of water that continues to produce, I can't remember how many gallons every single day, but a very large amount of gallons every single day. So some people were healed by washing in the water or bathing in the water, but most of the miracles take place during the Eucharistic procession when the priest blesses the crowd, and especially all the sick who have gathered, with the Eucharist, with the monstrance. In other words, the presence of God, contact with God. And of course, as I mentioned, the individuals present need to have faith. So we too need to have faith. So these are some of the different ways in which we come into contact with God. But I also wanted to point out that it's also through the saints. In other words, the saints help us to be closer to God. In many ways, the saints help us to have greater faith. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19, if you want to look it up, chapter 19, I believe it's verse 11. At least it starts at verse 11. It talks about the fact that many people brought handkerchiefs and aprons to St. Paul. Touched these handkerchiefs and aprons to the body of St. Paul. Then they took those handkerchiefs and aprons and brought it to the sick, touched the sick with those handkerchiefs and aprons, and the sick were healed. And it mentions that people who were possessed were delivered by means of these aprons and handkerchiefs. So in other words, coming into contact with the saints, even if it is just through some cloth or material, can bring us into the presence of God. In other words, St. Paul, he states, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." So St. Paul was transformed. God was present within St. Paul. Now, of course, our Lord is more fully present in the Eucharist than he is in a saint like someone like St. Paul. But the thing about the saints is that they not only lead us to God, they enable us to have greater faith. They're an example to us. And this is why we should have a devotion to the saints and honor the saints, such as, today, St. Anthony Zachariah. But they inspire us to imitate their way of life. And this is very important. So in other words, if we want to get closer to God, read the lives of the saints. Read about them. Read the books that they have written also. If we want to get more out of our Holy Communions, yes, we need to approach with greater faith. And when we receive Holy Communion, it's a fairly quick event. And this is why Eucharistic adoration is also so extremely beneficial, because when people come for Eucharistic adoration, we're focused on our Eucharistic Lord. And because we're praying to our Eucharistic Lord, it's kind of like reiterating in our mind, in our imagination, in our thought processes, this is Jesus. Jesus is truly present here. God is truly present here. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. The living Christ. He's watching me as I am praying. And when we remind ourselves of all these things during Eucharistic adoration, it disposes us to have those same sentiments, those same thoughts and imaginations when we approach our Eucharistic Lord in Holy Communion, so that ideally we get more out of our Holy Communions. So yes, let us draw close to Christ, to God. Let us be united to him as best as we can, but let us also approach him with great faith, asking not merely for the things that we need for ourselves, but asking on behalf of everyone.